The Russian government has advanced a number of justifications for its invasion of Ukraine on February 24th and its continuation of the conflict since. Some of those explanations have evolved, some goals have changed, but one item has been remarkably constant in Vladimir Putin's speaking points, not just in the lead up to the invasion, but also in the years leading up to it. And that has been the containment of NATO expansionism. Russia under Putin has been determined to prevent the ongoing expansion of the defensive North Atlantic Treaty Organization alliance. Putin has always made it clear that one of his goals is the containment of NATO expansion and the pushing of NATO forces as far away from the Russian border as possible. You'll recall that some of Russia's demands in the lead up to the February 24th invasion were not just that NATO guarantee that Ukraine would never join NATO, but also that NATO forward position forces rolled back to a line that they basically occupied in the 90s, undoing the forward basing and expansion that has taken place since. Now, the problem with this is that while the final result of the Ukraine conflict is still uncertain, and that conflict continues for days and will likely continue for weeks, months, maybe even a year or more from now, one thing has already become certain, and that is that the formerly neutral and non-aligned states of Sweden and Finland have now announced their intention to join NATO. Now, before the invasion of Ukraine, there was basically zero chance of this happening. Public opinion in both nations strongly opposed NATO membership, but something about the sight of Russian tanks racing across the European plain in Ukraine and the scenes that have come out of that conflict have caused a complete 180-degree shift in public opinion and political opinion in both of these nations. Finnish and Swedish membership will add to NATO an additional 800-mile border with Russia, 2 additional strong economies, and 2 capable militaries. It is hard to overestimate just how dramatic a swing this is from a social and a historical and a political perspective. So really, if Vladimir Putin has achieved anything so far in this war, it is to cause a quantum shift in the relations between these two states and their other European security partners. So what am I going to be covering? The first thing is I'm going to throw out a couple of caveats, because I think some in the media and also some other commentators have gotten ahead of themselves in basically describing this as a done deal or talking about this to a greater extent than it probably merits at this particular phase. So I'm going to put a few of those warnings up front. Then I'm going to look at both Finland, Sweden, their relations, and also their history of neutrality. You can't really appreciate how dramatic a shift this is, politically, socially, militarily, unless you understand how deeply embedded non-alignment and neutrality has been in these respective nations, and for how long. I'm then going to look at the Finnish and Swedish militaries. What capability do they bring to NATO? What does NATO bring to them? And what sort of additional benefits does that unlock for the alliance and for these nations? I'm then going to look at the strategic impacts. How does this impact things in the European security area? And what does this mean in the case of some of the potential flashpoint conflicts that could have erupted, even if they're not particularly likely, that could erupt between NATO or between Sweden, Finland, and Russia? And finally, I'm going to look at the national and regional implications. What does this mean for the individual nations involved? What does this mean for Finland and Sweden? What does this mean for the United States? What does this mean for Russia? What does this mean for some of the other nations in Europe? So let's get into it. And we'll open with caveats, I think. And the biggest caveat over all of this is that this is not a done deal. Finland and Sweden may have applied to join NATO. They may have made clear that they intend to join NATO, but at the end of the day, unanimous support of all other NATO members is necessary in order to get them into the alliance. And at the moment, Turkey's holding out until certain demands are met. Now, without going into too much detail, one of the complicating factors here is that one of Turkey's demands has been that Sweden cut support for certain Kurdish organizations that Turkey regards as hostile or as terrorists. The complicating factor there, of course, is that the Swedish government currently enjoys, I think, a one-vote majority in its parliament, and the vote that it relies on is that of Amina Kakabaveh, who is a woman of Kurdish origin, whose support for the government is contingent on its continued support of those Kurdish organizations. So how this negotiation with Turkey and whatnot plays out is still up in the air. Generally, it seems more likely than not that a deal will eventually be struck, given the overwhelming support in the rest of the alliance and the number of things that the other allied partners, including the United States, might be able to bring to bear to convince Erdogan. But it's important to caveat up front, NATO membership for these countries isn't a done deal. I'm going to make this presentation on the assumption that a deal will be done so we can talk about its implications, but that was the warning up front. I don't want to miss the chance in this episode to give Vladimir Putin props for the incredible recruitment effort he has done and just what a dramatic political change he's managed to manifest here. So I'm going to go through some of the history so you can understand just what it is Vladimir has achieved. So Sweden's history with neutrality, relatively long, close to 2 centuries. So I think most people who learn about Sweden's history have a giant gap in their understanding in terms of how it's taught in schools. We sort of assume the Swedes went from sort of Vikings and then they became the IKEA people, and the bit in between is sort of a giant question mark. Sweden, the phase that most people don't learn about, the phase in between, includes a part where Sweden was actually a great empire, a strongly militant, highly religious kingdom that waged war both in Europe, in the Baltics, that expanded to include Baltic territories, Finnish territories, that intervened in Germany, that intervened in Poland and was one of the reasons for the destruction of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. It was, for a long period, an immensely powerful state. Russia is one of the reasons that that state comes to an end. Sweden fights what's called the Great Northern War with Russia. There's this guy called Peter the Great, you might have heard of him. In that war, Sweden discovers that it has a great many things, that it has great deposits of iron ore and natural resources, that it has immense mercantile acumen, great seafarers. What Sweden lacks, it finds out in the Great Northern War, is a sufficient number of Swedes. The Russian state under Peter is able to mobilize sufficient manpower to grind the Swedes under Charles XII down and basically break the back of the Swedish Empire. Sweden is then dismembered during the Napoleonic War. Russia gains Finland from Sweden. Up to 1809, Finland is part of the Swedish Empire. Sweden's response to all of this is basically to go into 200 years of armed neutrality. Now, armed neutrality is an interesting term for basically describing a situation where you stockpile a whole bunch of guns and basically point them in all directions at once and tell everyone to basically rack off. Now, just about everyone plans to invade Sweden during World War II for various reasons. The Brits want the Swedes to stop selling iron to the Germans don't want the Swedes to stop selling iron to the Germans. And if they could get away with it, the Germans would rather not pay for it at all. So it'd be kind of convenient if they dominated Sweden. So Sweden builds up a huge military force during the Second World War, basically to keep everyone off their patch, which succeeds. And they continue to do this into the Cold War. Sweden maintains a very large air force, a significant military capability. It's friendly with the Western powers, in particular the United States, but its policy is basically neutrality. For a long period, basically what Sweden's idea is that if they stayed neutral long enough, then they might not get hit in the initial exchange of nuclear weapons that kills basically everyone else on the planet. And that would allow Sweden to have a chance of surviving the rest of the war once people have fired off most of their nuclear weapons. I mean, heck, for a period of time there, Sweden actually has a secret nuclear weapons program. In the 1950s and 60s, the Swedes, the socially progressive Nordic state of Sweden, has a secret nuclear weapons program that by the mid-1960s is probably within about 6 months of delivering them an atomic device, and soon after that would have delivered them probably 2 or 3 more. The Riksdag does eventually nix this idea. Sweden never tests a nuclear bomb, but it gets perilously close. The historical record, I think, is a little ambiguous on whether the nukes would have come with easy-to-read instructions and or been flat pack, but you do need to recall that, like I said, again, Sweden was taking its armed part of its armed neutrality very seriously during the Cold War. That neutrality only starts to fray in about 2009, even though there's been alignment there for a long period of time, and also the armed bit falls away after the Cold War. Sweden today is not the armed juggernaut that it was either during the Second World War or through much of the Cold War. So basically, 200 years of being a very angry pincushion telling everyone else to stay away. Finland's story is a little bit more complicated and much more closely tied with Russia. In 1809, Finland becomes part of the Russian Empire. It's the Principality of Finland, or the Grand Duchy of Finland. What this basically is the leader of the King of Finland, or the Grand Duke of Finland, is the Russian Tsar. But Finland has its own governing senate and institutions, and is basically autonomous. So during the 1850s in particular, things are actually pretty decent in Russian Finland. There's a Tsar called Alexander II. That statue of him is still there in Helsinki. And when one of the eventual successors is crowned, Tsar Nicholas, that guy there, Mannerheim, we'll see him again in a moment, he's the chap there marching with the sword in the coronation parade. So there's a very close relationship between Finland and Russia for the better part of a century. The problems begin with something called Russification in 1899. This is basically where the Russians decide that the Finns really want to be Russians. That what should happen is that the Finnish institutions, the Finnish Senate, should basically be increasingly subordinated to the Russian state. And the Finns really should, throw their own laws out and use Russian laws instead, and they should use the Russian language instead. And generally, they should just become good Russians. Now, the Finns were generally fine with the idea of being in the Russian Empire, but they weren't particularly keen to be Russians. You might see some shades there of what's happening in Ukraine right now. This is a common feature of history, you'll find. Russians deciding that other groups of people really want to be Russian-speaking cultural Russians, and that causing a bit of a breakdown in relations. So Finland's part of the Russian Empire going into World War I, but Russification's pretty much destroyed all the old goodwill, and the moment that the Russian Empire falls apart, Finland's out of there. Finland has a civil war between the Reds and the Whites. The Reds are backed by the Soviet Union, surprise, surprise, and the Whites, partly thanks to the efforts of this guy here, Mannerheim, do win, and Finland becomes an independent republic. Most people know what happens next. 1939, the Soviet Union decides that it wants a chunk of Finland, ostensibly for its own national protection and to stop Finland eventually aligning with Germany. So the Soviet Union invades Finland in what becomes known as the Winter War. Now, this war's gained a nearly mythical character, and I'm going to discuss it for a second because it is a bit of a meme, and we need to clarify this a little bit. The meme basically goes like this. The Soviet Union of 1939 is a massive military juggernaut with hundreds of thousands, indeed millions of men if it mobilizes. It has thousands upon thousands of tanks and armored vehicles. It has a huge supply of artillery, and it's coming after, well, little old Finland that basically has no allies to call on. Finland in 1939 has 32 tanks. The Soviets attack on that front with about 2,000, and by the end of the war, that number grows to 6,000. And yet, the Soviet offensive initially goes basically nowhere. The Finns, using mobility, good tactics, skis for mobility, strong fortifications, basically pick apart the Soviet army. Casualties over the whole war favour the Finns by 5-1, but in the early stages, it's even more dramatic. The Soviet army basically gets chewed up and spat out in the early phases by the Finns. But this doesn't mean that the Finns won the Winter War. The war ends in a peace treaty, but in that peace treaty, Finland loses a considerable amount of territory. And indeed, it's basically a deception operation that allows the Finns to end the war on their terms anyway. By the end of the war, the Finns were basically out, completely tapped out of manpower, of shells, of just about everything. And they put a lot of effort into pretending or showing the Russians that they had a lot more left in reserve than they did. They were bleeding themselves quite deliberately, holding positions that weren't militarily sound, just to convince the Russians that they still had fight left in them. So Finland, in the end, loses a lot in the Winter War, even though it fights far more strongly than is expected, and manages to survive becoming a Russian puppet state. Now, you'll remember I said a moment ago that one of the reasons the Soviet Union invades is to stop Finland from allying with Germany or fighting alongside Germany in a war with the Soviet Union. So, of course, now that Finland's lost a whole bunch of territory to the Soviet Union and there's a whole bunch of bad blood there, Finland feels like it has to attack the USSR when the Germans invade it in 1941, making the whole thing a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is called the Continuation War. Finland performs very, very well in the Continuation War. It basically takes back all of the territory it lost initially. And again, the casualty ratios far favour the Finnish forces through most of the war. But in the end, just like the Winter War, you could argue they lose. Finland suffers about 200,000 casualties, actually more than 200,000 casualties. And yet, in the end, it loses even more territory than it did after the Winter War, and the USSR is able to impose a whole bunch of conditions on Finland. One of those is reparations, and one of those is non-alignment, the idea that Finland needed to allow the Communist Party to operate and then not join any of these Western military alliances that were going to pop up. So Finland spends most of the Cold War flying MiGs and being officially non-aligned. This basically stays in place until it joins the EU in 1995, the reason being with the Soviet Union gone, it's not quite as terrified of Soviet tank armies racing across the border to enforce its non-alignment anymore. I mean, really, this whole history makes the Russian invasion of Ukraine even more questionable. In Finland, Russia destroyed its influence by trying to convince the local population that they were basically Russians and their statehood were a myth. Like in Finland, which destroyed the relations between Finland and the Russian Empire, they invaded it in order to keep it out of another alliance, and then by invading it, pushed it right into the hands of another alliance. They say history doesn't repeat, but it sure does often rhyme. And I think the history of Russia and the Soviet Union with Finland and the recent relations between Russia and Ukraine certainly rhyme. So what now? Finland and Sweden are both applying to join NATO. In doing so, they basically have the near unanimous support of NATO members. There's an asterisk there with Erdogan and Turkey, and a question mark over Hungary, who have been quiet, but I imagine they'll go along with this one. They've also got very strong domestic backing for this manoeuvre. They're very keen to make it happen. Russia, in return, has put out a lot of, let's just say, mixed messages, from saying that this represents total hybrid war by NATO on Russia and threatening nuclear missile deployments and military and technical, quote, measures, to Vladimir Putin then later coming out and saying this is basically not a very big deal. They've cut electricity supply to Finland, which Finland can deal with. They've threatened to deploy nuclear missiles to the Baltic, which is not a big deal because they already have nuclear missiles in the Baltic. Russia has a lot of nuclear missiles, and it seems to use them as the catch-all whenever something isn't diplomatically going its way. The problem is, for the reasons we covered in our nuclear bluff video, the diplomatic power of deploying nuclear-capable systems is actually quite minimal and certainly doesn't look like it's going to sway anything in this particular situation. So it does seem for the moment like Russia is not going to take any measures that realistically will stop Finland and Sweden joining NATO. But that's enough history. Let's talk metal. What does Finland, what does Sweden bring to NATO in terms of their military power, and how does that change the balance of power? Let's talk about Finland first. It's fair to say that the Finnish military, even though Finland was ostensibly non-aligned, is pretty single-mindedly configured for the task of defending against Russia. The nation embraces what is called a total defense concept. This means that it has a relatively small peacetime military. 23,000 in the army, 3,000 in the navy, 3,000 in the air force. A relatively small military force. The key is what happens in the event of war. In the event of war, Finland is capable of rapidly mobilizing to the point where it's got 285,000 men in the army and 46,000 in the navy and the air force. This is achieved through a combination of conscription, refresher training, and practicing what mobilization means. Beyond that, Finland's got an even larger base of people who have done their conscript service, have some military experience, but aren't part of this initial mobilization plan. So if Finland takes losses, there are people who are available who, with some more refresher training, can take their place and maintain the strength of the organization. At the same time, Finland is basically one giant bomb shelter. Just about every major structure in Finland is required to be built with a bomb shelter, so they have a capacity to shelter in place a very large portion of their civilian population. The idea here is that Finland is able to toggle very quickly from zero to total war, destroy the invader at all costs, babushkas throwing Molotov cocktails kind of thing. And this is meant to be a dissuasive force. Now, relative to that massive mobilized strength, which would make the mobilized Finnish army one of the largest armies in Europe, and indeed, it makes the Finnish mobilized army roughly equivalent to the Russian active duty army forces, which is quite remarkable. Finland adds a relatively compact but decently modern suite of equipment. The table of equipment is relatively limited relative to the number of mobilized personnel. They don't have the Polish tank fleet of 800 plus, for example. What they do have is a small collection of relatively modern kit. 200 Leopard 2s, 200 infantry fighting vehicles, about 600 APCs, nearly 700 artillery pieces. These are all military balance 2020 figures, by the way. They have a decent array of SAM capabilities, and they currently fly 55 FA-18 Hornets, but the F-35 is on its way. So this is a mixture of Soviet-era, late Cold War Western, and modern post-Cold War Western equipment, all mixed together into a military force. Now, this is clearly not an army that is designed to go do Desert Storm. It is not an expeditionary force. It doesn't have the strategic airlift, it doesn't have the massive logistical tail, and it doesn't have the body of equipment for its mobilized strength necessary to, say, put this major force on the other side of the world and fight a war the way the United States can. What it's designed to do is create a very large, dense infantry and mechanized force in Finland or in Finland's immediate surroundings and defend Finland with it. So above all, what Finland brings to the NATO alliance is the ability to raise a very large number of men very quickly in the event of some military contingency in their specific region. Then you've got the Swedish armed forces. The Swedish armed forces, like I said, they've kind of given up the hedgehog highly armed, highly militarized armed neutrality approach many, many, many years ago. And as a result now, frankly, the Swedish military is tiny. It's configured for territorial defense, but it doesn't have the same total national defense concept that Finland does. As a result, there's only 6,850 active duty troops in the Swedish army. The Navy and the Air Force are likewise very small, and the number of reservists is comparatively tiny. They're not mobilising 200,000, they're mobilising 10,000. But by comparison to its manpower profile, Sweden's very equipment dense. They've got 120 Stridsvagn tanks, which are basically modified Leopard 2A5s, lots of IFVs and APCs. So many that you wonder if anyone in the Swedish army ever has to walk anywhere. They have so many transports relative to the number of men they have in service. They have submarines. But most importantly for Sweden is they have 6 squadrons, so 72 active and 96 total of these Gripen fighters, which are manufactured by Saab. Yes, that Saab, in service. And they're going to be augmented and replaced by an even more capable version, the Gripen E or Super Gripen. There's a number of ways to describe it, which is a highly capable 4th generation fighter. So what this means is that relative to its size, what Sweden brings to the table is a very, very capable air force with modern missile technology and also a very strong defense industry. Sweden possesses a very well-developed, capable defense sector. Saab is obviously the most famous because they're capable of producing aircraft, missile systems, sensors, and a number of other things. But Sweden is also involved in the production of rockets, infantry weapons, and a number of other munitions. The Gripen itself, which is the flagship product of Sweden. Small nations struggle to build fighters, and yet Sweden has an uninterrupted history of building its own fighter aircraft that goes back into the Second World War. During the Cold War, they built the Draken and the Viggen, and now they built the Gripen. There's opportunities here for this defense sector to be integrated with the wider NATO setting and add its strength there. There's very strong existing industrial ties between the Swedish defense sector and the British defense sector and Norway and Finland, and there's a lot of cross-ownership between these various companies. But bringing them into NATO just makes it a little bit easier for these companies to cooperate and to market products to each other. So one of the great things that Sweden brings, it's not the army, frankly. It's not the army. The army is not going to be particularly important in a crisis. It's the fact they have a very significant air combat component equipped with modern munitions to contribute and a new generation of jets on order, like the Finns. When you combine the Swedish Air Force and the Finnish Air Force, especially once they both get their new generations of aircraft, suddenly this starts to become a very significant air combat contingent relative to the sort of stuff the Russians are fielding. In many ways, you could describe the Swedish and Finnish militaries as sort of mirrors of each other. Finland has the manpower, but questions over the scale of materiel. Sweden has far too few people and far too much materiel. So there might be possibilities for cooperation moving forward. Sweden is basically the person who owns 4 identical AR-15s, and you have to wonder if in the event of a conflict they're going to try and fire 2 from each arm at the same time. There's a lot of equipment there. So what does bringing all of this into NATO actually mean? NATO versus the status quo, because there's a lot of debate over how much joining NATO for these countries actually changes anything. And I think the answer is a very definitive yes. The clearest reason is because Article 5 is guaranteed legal certainty when it comes to defensive arrangements. Article 5 is a part of the NATO treaty that says an attack on one member in certain geographies is an attack on all, and that all members of the alliance are required to take military steps in order to defend each other. This is basically a requirement that if someone takes so much as a step over the border of one of the NATO nations, everyone else is going to be there, guns out, as soon as they can possibly get there. This is a legal certainty when it comes to Finland and Sweden's participation in any sort of European contingency, and also the wider NATO's participation in any threats to those specific countries themselves. Invoking Article 5 starts an all-in brawl faster than, rolling into a British pub and insulting the Queen or breaking out a Serbian flag at a Croatian soccer match. It causes things to escalate very quickly, and because opponents know that invocation of Article 5 is going to cause this massive dramatic military escalation, no one's particularly tempted to try. If you go in for the grapple with Estonia, Uncle Sam's coming in off the bench with the chair, and Uncle Sam carries a really big chair. But NATO is also so much more than Article 5. It's more than just the obligation to come to each other's defence. It's a clubhouse and it's pretty full-time. They do planning together. They have joint headquarters. They plan for joint logistics. They plan for joint efforts in the event of conflict. And if you're not aligned, you're not going to be in that room. NATO isn't going to write war plans incorporating Finland. I mean, it would be a little bit awkward if Russia, say, invaded the Baltics and Stoltenberg had to go to Helsinki and basically say, hey, can we borrow your army to intervene? And the Finns were like, okay, we should probably start planning how to do that now. Or even worse, said, yeah, no, we might just sit this one out. Joining NATO allows you to resolve those joint planning issues, to do scenario planning, and to integrate your forces so that you know how you're going to respond or can respond in the event of a crisis. NATO is also about technological exchange. It's about standardization so that when these armies operate, they can operate together. The reason we can say, when we're describing the bullets used by the M4 and the M16 and so many NATO weapons, the reason we can call that round 5.56mm NATO is because everyone in NATO pretty much has agreed that that dimension cartridge is going to be the 5.56mm round, which means that the French and the Germans and the POMs and the Americans and whatnot, if they get all messed up and they're fighting in a conflict, they can chuck each other ammo. They can fire each other's 155mm artillery rounds. They can fire each other's rifle rounds. There's a lot of standardization in everything from avionics to communications to tactical practices. All of these things that enable countries to actually operate as joint battle groups together rather than just a disparate group of people running around like chickens with their heads cut off. And the other point is that NATO is quite a jealous girlfriend. Article 8, which people don't talk about very much, very simple. It basically provides that if you join NATO, you're not allowed to sign any other treaties that diminish your responsibilities in NATO. So you can't go off and then sign a conflicting alliance with someone else. This is the definition of alignment. It confirms alignment. So as long as you're in NATO, you can't sign, say, a treaty with Russia that might undermine your duties to NATO. You couldn't sign a treaty with any other country, maybe China, for example, that might undermine your duties to NATO to support other countries in the event of an Article 5 conflict. So joining NATO is more than just friendship. It's about joining the planning, it's about getting into the clubhouse, and it's about agreeing that the relationship is going to be, if not exclusive, certainly prime amongst all the relationships that a country has. And this has very significant strategic implications, although I do think they have sometimes been overblown in the media. Because there's a huge focus in the media on big war-type threats. How does this change the overall balance of conventional military power between Russia and NATO? This is where people tend to focus on the 800-mile border and the potential of all these NATO bases in Finland that will threaten St. Petersburg and the entire Russian northern flank, and oh no, Murmansk is now within range. All this sort of stuff. So my first thing to say here is yes, the NATO border with Russia will expand greatly, and Russia's going to hate that. There will be a significant increase in the total assets available to NATO, namely that they're adding the Finnish and the Swedish militaries. And particularly in the case of Sweden, that's a very significant force in the event of a major contingency. There's also hypothetically possibilities to threaten Russia in terms of intelligence terms or even first strike scenarios if you move, say, significant NATO bases and nuclear weapons into Finland and Sweden. But Finland and Sweden aren't actually keen to have bases and nukes on their territory. They've made this clear so far. They want to join NATO, but that doesn't mean that they want American nuclear weapons or permanent American bases and forces stationed in their countries. That's not what they're in this for. It's not what they're interested in doing. And I'd also say, well, is this really important? Because the ledger, the balance of conventional military strength before Finland and Sweden join and after Finland and Sweden join, it didn't really favour Russia to begin with. The addition of these two nations certainly adds to the NATO side of the ledger, but not in a way that actually changes the outcome of any major war scenario. Any major war scenario probably ends in nuclear fireballs, and that doesn't matter whether the Finns and Swedes are involved or not. It just means how many IKEA stores are going to be destroyed in the nuclear fireball. I mean, seriously, under what conditions would NATO bomb St. Petersburg? Under what conditions would NATO attack Murmansk? These are not common or credible scenarios that you talk about. So yes, Finland and Sweden joining changes the balance of power, but not in a way that significantly changes or threatens Russia. So the overall balance of power is more so the question of position. and specifically where Sweden and Finland are and where their armies are. So, yes, St. Petersburg, Murmansk, more than 1,000 kilometers of border, all of that geography is true. But my contention is we shouldn't get too bogged down in continuation war 2 scenarios. The idea that NATO and Finland are going to stream across the Russian border and reclaim all the lost Finnish territories and get everyone nuked in the process. That's basically bad fan fiction. Ultimately, the frontage, that additional border, doesn't really matter because it's not really a credible scenario. What matters is what happens in the event of scenarios that might actually play out. Limited offensives, limited wars, small conflicts that have the potential to explode. And the reason I harp on this is because people love to ask the question, both on the internet and also in strategic journals and studies, who would win between pick actor A and pick actor B here? And so often they don't ask the question of, well, why would actor A and actor B have a punch-up in the first place? Like, what is the conditions that leads to those two powers having an all-out brawl? How would a war ever start? The example I always come to is that during the 1920s, a lot of people obsessed over the prospect of a war between the United Kingdom and the United States. And the idea was the United States was a growing trade power, the UK was the established trade power, they both had large navies, so obviously they will fight, right? But no one ever stopped to ask the question of, how would you convince either the British or American people that something was so important that it was worth going to war with the other major English-speaking power over? That was a question that I think was never sufficiently answered, and instead the defence establishments of both countries basically just used the whole thing in order to guarantee continued naval investment. So I'm sorry, guys, Red Storm Rising isn't happening. There's no scenario where the Russians launch a major all-out ground offensive in Europe to push across the Rhine River all the way to Paris, and then it ends in a nuclear fireball killing us all. Mostly because, as I've said before, everyone dying is usually considered a suboptimal strategic outcome. So military planners and politicians usually won't favour a scenario where the end result is nuclear annihilation for them and everyone that they care about and love. What's much more likely, and where these alliances matter, is what happens in the case of very small conflicts where there's a risk of miscalculation. What do I mean here? Well, I mean Russia went into Crimea and it didn't start a war. It got away with it. Russia might feel tempted in other places to launch a limited offensive or a limited operation designed to achieve a specific thing. Gambling that NATO or allies or the countries involved won't retaliate on a large scale. And there's a number of those scenarios which, while I don't think they're particularly likely, are certainly much more relevant than who wins in an all-out brawl between NATO and Russia. So the first example here, and I'll show you a clip from Russian state TV in a moment, is what I'll call the Gotland scenario. Gotland is a highly strategic island in the middle of the Baltic. It's controlled by Sweden. And Russian media and ideologues love to talk about scenarios where they go take Gotland. The concern that they would have in this calculus is, could you take Gotland without it sparking a larger war? And there's a lot of reasons they might want Gotland. You'll see this in the clip in a moment. But it basically allows whoever owns it, if you're the Russians, for example, to put a bunch of long-range anti-air and anti-ship missiles and radar systems in the middle of the Baltic and basically dominate shipping routes to Latvia, to Lithuania, to Estonia, their airspace, to control most of the strategic borders of Sweden, to effectively bottle the Finns. A lot more than what you can do just owning Kaliningrad, although I'd like to point out they can do an awful lot just owning Kaliningrad. So in a scenario where Sweden isn't in NATO, there's every possibility that they might be able to pull something like this, or at least they might think they're capable of pulling something like this off. They do it quickly, under the cover of night, maybe it's airborne troops, maybe it's a naval landing, it's certainly by surprise. They seize the island, they occupy it, they fortify it, and they basically say, ours now, and ask Stockholm whether or not it really wants to start an all-out conflict to try and reclaim the island against its nuclear-armed neighbour. That's the Gotland scenario. With Sweden inside NATO, this suddenly becomes a lot less likely to succeed, if it was at all likely to succeed in the first place. Sweden, this scenario now, would rationally call on its NATO allies. NATO would come together and presumably kick Russia off Gotland. They wouldn't nuke Moscow or nuke St. Petersburg unless Moscow started nuking countries first, which it wouldn't do because it would then itself get nuked. I mean, think about it like a gambler. Before joining NATO, the Gotland scenario for Russia is basically, Let's just say you have a 60% chance of ending up with a lovely tourist destination island in exchange for basically nothing. You've got a 30% chance of ending up with a lovely tourist destination island in exchange for angry words from Stockholm, a couple of air battles, and some angry sanctions from Europe. So basically call that the Crimea scenario. Or a 10% chance that Europe joins anyway and everyone blows up. Well, it's a really nice tourist island, so maybe you take that chance. Maybe. But once Sweden joins NATO, it's now maybe a 5% chance that you end up with the island and everyone backs down. About a 75% chance that you just get your ass kicked off the island and you're in a worse situation than if you had started in the first place. And then the balance of the chance is basically, again, everyone dies in a nuclear fireball. Now, residents of Gotland, your island is great, but at those odds, I think I'm a lot less likely to risk invading you guys. The expanded version of the Gotland scenario is the Baltic scenario. I know from my analytics that I have a number of people from Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania who watch this video. Hey guys, this is your moment. So again, Russian state media loves talking about this scenario. Usually it's paired with a Gotland scenario, where they seize Gotland, they use that to dominate the airspace, they place a lot of their jamming equipment there, and then they launch an offensive. There's two versions of the Baltic scenario as the Russians express it. The first is a very, very limited one. They launch a limited attack, Little Green Men style, so Crimea style, where a bunch of Russian troops go in and occupy the corridor between Belarus and Kaliningrad, giving Russia a land bridge to the Kaliningrad enclave. That's one option. Basically, the Russian troops turn up, hopefully no one's in their direct way, they dig in and they basically dare the NATO troops to start shooting first in order to throw them out, gambling that they won't do so. The more aggressive version of this is they cut the corridor, but at the same time, they blitz Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania with every military force that they can pull together. They try and take those countries very quickly, and they say, NATO, hey, do you really want to start a nuclear war or fight a conventional ground conflict to try and dig us out of these territories? Okay, future me here. I was going to put the video from Russian state TV here of the plan to take Gotland and the Baltics. Unfortunately, I haven't found a way to do that without either A, copyright strike, or B, a decline in quality. So what I will do is I'll link the description. The images I'm showing are pretty self-explanatory. The basic plan is you invade Gotland, you fill it with surface-to-air missiles and anti-ship missiles and a bunch of radar jamming equipment, and then you invade the Baltic states after declaring a no-fly zone, which you enforce with your missiles on Gotland. Is it crazy? Yes. Was it on Russian state TV? Yes. Is it official Russian policy? Almost certainly no. But, it's demonstrative regardless. The gamble here is that if I can achieve victory quickly enough, if I can occupy Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania fast enough, then Western powers won't have the appetite. If I've got those governments captured, if I've got the leaders in custody, if there's no one to call for aid or invoke NATO assistance, then there might not be the political pressure or the willingness on the NATO side to go kick me out of Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia, especially if the Russians then move up nuclear weapons into these areas and say, mine now. And again, just like Gotland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, beautiful countries, worth having. Great addition to Russia if you could get them again. They certainly were a huge benefit to the Soviet Union and to the Russian Empire. Indeed, for a long time, a lot of the Russian Empire's nobility were Balts, Baltic Germans particularly. So if you're Russia, here's the calculus in this situation. A couple of things matter. One, can you actually achieve your military objectives, and can you do it quickly before the rest of NATO is able to get their act together, before the Americans can modern reforge their way to Europe and kick you out? So can you change the conditions on the ground quickly enough? Can you take the capitals, overthrow the governments, and short-circuit the NATO response? That's part one. Part two is how willing and committed is NATO to defending these countries? Because for a long period of time, there was no permanent, and there indeed still isn't, permanent large-scale NATO basing of troops in these countries. There's often some NATO troops there on temporary deployments, and they're basically there to be a tripwire, i.e. they're there to force the Russians to understand that if they do invade, they're going to have to kill Americans and Brits, and as a result, increase the likelihood of retaliation. So that's the second part of this. How likely is NATO to respond in a hostile fashion and really push the issue if Russia muscles its way into the Baltics? Finland and Sweden have a really big impact on a Baltic scenario. That's because On point one, the Finnish and Swedish armies are pretty damn close to the Baltic area of operations. The Finns can mobilise very quickly. The Swedes have air assets. The Finns have air assets, all of which are capable of striking not just targets in the Baltic, but also targets that would be necessary to support an offensive in the Baltic. We asked before, when might NATO bomb St. Petersburg? Well, it might bomb military depots near St. Petersburg if they were supporting First Guard tank army trying to overrun Estonia, for example. So in this scenario, NATO now has basically permanently positioned something like an additional 150 combat aircraft, a permanent army force of about 30,000, and a rapidly mobilised force of 250,000 in the Baltic area. And then for the second part of the question, how committed is NATO to their defence? It would not be an exaggeration to say that there are very close political, cultural, and strategic ties between the new members and the Baltic states, particularly between Finland. There was talk for a while in history about actually joining Finland with some of these states because of the historical, I suppose, closeness of the peoples there. So you can bet that in a Baltic scenario, some of the loudest voices for supporting Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are going to come from these new NATO members. And they're also the ones who are the closest and most capable of immediately intervening. The presence of Finland in a scenario where there might be a limited war also means the Russians do have to watch that border. Because if the Finns decide to start raising trouble along that border in order to take pressure off Estonia, well, the Russians better have troops and assets there in order to protect themselves. The third scenario is not really a conflict scenario as more of a skirmish and an ongoing geopolitical struggle. Now, our brain is used to seeing the world map in a pretty standard Mercator projection. Basically, we see it laterally with the equator in the middle. We need to remember that the world is a sphere. I'm sorry to any flat earthers in my audience, but it is in fact a sphere, and these nations border the Arctic, which is an increasingly strategically relevant area. Norway, Denmark, Canada, the United States all have very significant claims in the Arctic that are economically and strategically relevant, and so does Russia. So the Arctic area of operations, the far north, the idea of potential Arctic conflict or skirmishing with Russia over these territories is increasingly relevant. This might surprise you, but the Finns and Swedes are relatively used to fighting in cold weather. And their presence near Russia does, as I said, place additional pressure on the Russians in these sort of small war and skirmishing scenarios. And there's a traditional alignment that's very close between Sweden and Norway in particular, and Norway is one of the countries that is most likely to be pressured by Russia over its claims, and Denmark too, over their claims in the Arctic. So by adding Finland and Sweden, basically you're making it a little less likely that Russia's ever in its calculus going to think it's worth starting shit in the Arctic or skirmishing over islands or specific positions. Because again, there is a greater conventional military presence that can help turn the tide of those skirmishes and put additional pressure on Russian frontiers should things ever get a little tense. The other impact that I really want to talk about, because this is my shtick, is the potential for industrial integration. As I've said before, NATO is more than just a defensive alliance. It's a giant industrial and technological exchange and standardization organization that provides immense commercial opportunities for everyone within it. It's not just the footy team. It's the merchandising, it's the managing, it's the marketing, it's the industry behind it. And that's where Sweden and Finland can make a little bit of a difference. Finland and Sweden have major industrial players, and we're moving more of those industrial players into NATO. It unlocks fewer concerns over sales of technology and exchanges of information, much easier to do joint ventures, which are already favoured. But we should see more technologies that are produced out of Sweden, probably in wider NATO service. Sweden produces very capable air-to-air missiles, very good anti-ship missiles. Saab is capable of manufacturing some quite high-tech stuff. This opens up a lot more customers for Saab and for the various other manufacturers, and it also offers them greater access to technology and joint ventures that they can use. We've talked before about one of the advantages that NATO enjoys is its immense economic and military industrial advantage. And frankly, this is just going to make the situation even more asymmetrical when it comes to other potential opponents like Russia, competitors in the global arms market. It's just expanding that NATO arms ecosystem that little bit further. I mean, who knows? Maybe we'll see even more NATO powers using the Meteor or flying the Gripen. Who knows? And I think it's now worth looking at what this means for the individual nations involved. Because while it's fine and good to talk about what this means in potential conflict scenarios, the reality is most of those scenarios will probably never eventuate, and probably never would have eventuated even if these countries didn't join NATO. But the membership decision is still going to change things for them regardless. And in terms of nations to talk about, it's obvious to start with Finland and Sweden themselves. Again, this is not really a titanic change for Finland and Sweden in terms of alignment. While technically neutral and non-aligned, both are part of the EU and both have strongly lent towards Europe and the West for a significant period of time. But joining NATO is still transformative in terms of their military obligations. Now, immediately I don't expect a huge amount to change. There won't be NATO bases in their territory. The militaries of both these nations won't change over much. They're both mostly NATO compliant already. There are opportunities here militarily in the medium and the long term. And I don't mean by launching Continuation 2.0, I don't mean Viking clapping all the way to Vladivostok or looting down the Volga River like in the good old days Sweden. What I mean is with NATO membership, Finland is no longer completely preoccupied with its own defence. In the event of a conventional conflict, it knows that NATO reinforcements are coming, which is something Finland has not historically known and is the opposite of the Finnish experience during, for example, the Winter War. At the same time, obligations to take part in overseas NATO deployments is probably going to rise. So there's a chance here for Finland and Sweden to adjust their defence policies. You have to ask, will Finland loosen its total defence concept? What does this mean for conscription? What does this mean for reservist service? What does this mean for the emphasis of investment in Finland? I'm sure that Europe is going to be really, really happy to have this large mobilizable Finnish force as a security bastion in the north. And it's going to give Finland a lot of political influence in the alliance. But if Finland wants to realise a security dividend, for example, it could probably afford to relax now that it's properly under a nuclear umbrella and part of the NATO defensive alliance. There's generally very high support, as I understand it, for conscription and the system of defence in Finland. My question is, if that ever changes, the option is available to these people to realise a security dividend. As for Sweden, well, I hope we get a new Sabaton song out of it, personally. Then there's Europe. Europe, it's hard to talk about as a unit, because as much as the EU may be a thing, it is still made up of distinct countries, and each have slightly different defence policies, or indeed, flagrantly different defence policies. But if there's any commonality to be found amongst all of them, here it is. No one in Europe wants a war in Europe. Everyone in Europe basically wants the international order of rules and norms to exist, this post-war international order of free trade, liberal norms and whatnot. They want that to persist. They want to be treated as equal partners of the United States rather than as subordinate partners. And they want their economies to be efficient, industrially rugged, and they want to maintain some sort of defence independence. Finland and Sweden are really important on all of these fronts. They add very considerably to Europe's conventional independence from America by adding a significant number of combat aircraft and of combat troops to the overall EU-sized ledger. They add more to Europe's defence industries and capabilities, and it's fair to say that Finland and Sweden are very closely aligned with most European states on the importance of preserving international rules and norms in the current international order. This also helps for Europe lessen the gap between the EU and NATO. There are relatively few members of the EU that aren't in NATO. With this, there will be 2 fewer, which will help harmonise European military relations. I think there's lots of unrealised possibilities here in the future for Europe, and really it demands its own video series. The possibilities of what European defence as a concept and what the European defence industry is capable of accomplishing in order to make it a truly independent and equal actor that sits alongside the United States. But hey, one step at a time. And then speaking of the United States, of course, because we love talking about the US, I think in the short term, the US understands this means it's probably going to have to increase its investment in Europe in order to establish even better relationships with Finland and Sweden, recapitalise NATO, and reinvigorate that structure. But in the medium term, deploying US forces to Europe is probably going to become marginally less important. The Russian army is being significantly weakened in Ukraine, and NATO's forces in the area are being considerably strengthened. You have to recall, NATO's forward deployed forces are usually relatively small. Troops want to be in their homelands. Troops don't want to be on foreign bases. There are all sorts of costs involved in moving men, women, and their families overseas for long, protracted periods of time. So if the troops are in situ, that's generally better. And Finns and Swedish troops are kind of exactly where NATO needs them to be in order to deal with most of the contingencies that NATO is worried about. So the emphasis on putting more US troops, more US assets into Europe is probably going to be reduced. Now, yes, that probably means less American influence over some of its European allies, but at the same time, it also means America is more free to rebalance some of its expenditure, some of its assets towards the Pacific, which is where America has been trying to pivot for the better part of a decade. It's just that regional contingencies keep getting in the way. Russia's scenarios are now less of a thing in American planning. Russia is less of a threat, Europe is more of secure, so America can spend more time and energy focusing on other threats. In essence, this is a giant, as the Australians would call it, free kick for US foreign policy. It considerably reduces the American defense burden and defense concerns in Europe, while at the same time giving them the freedom to pivot to other areas where they really want to be. And all of that leaves one standout loser, and that's Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin and the Russian Federation. When I did my video on who is winning the Russia-Ukraine war, I accepted that it's hard to provide enough evidence to answer the who is winning question. The question itself is really, really vague. You can look at and try and quantify losses, economic costs, territory, but because things like goals, what countries are trying to achieve, are so qualitative and ephemeral and it's hard to prove, answering the who is winning question in Ukraine is actually really difficult. With Finland and Sweden joining NATO, there is no ambiguity. People have said they enjoy the fact these videos are often very balanced. There is no balance here. Finland and Sweden are lost to Russia. NATO is expanding. NATO is stronger than it has been in living memory. And that is a titanic geopolitical defeat for a Russia that is learning that you cannot make friends with artillery barrages. Or at least not the sort of friends that you might want. Whatever happens in Ukraine, whatever happens in that conflict here on out, Russia has already suffered an incredible strategic reverse with Finland and Sweden pivoting to NATO. Even, I would say, in a scenario where they somehow prevail upon Turkey to block this membership, Finland and Sweden's hearts are now in NATO. And if they're blocked from joining it, I expect there'll be a whole bunch of additional bilateral security agreements or multilateral security agreements that basically mean Finland and Sweden end up joining NATO Light anyway, by any other name. They've already both put themselves under the UK's nuclear umbrella and signed a treaty there. I expect the same thing's going to happen in any scenario. Russia's border with NATO has expanded. NATO has gotten stronger at exactly the same time that Russia's conventional military strength is being ground down in Ukraine, and at the same time that its military industry and wider economy is being hollowed out by sanctions. Basically, if the idea here was to weaken NATO, divide NATO, and prevent its expansion, Putin has achieved NATO's unification and its expansion at the same time that Russia has been dramatically weakened. Congratulations, Vladimir. You are NATO's best ally in all of this. So let's end this with a summary. To most observers who don't live in these countries or who don't follow the history, Finnish and Swedish membership seems like the most natural thing in the world. The countries are far more European than anything else. They're progressive democracies. They belong in the NATO camp, at least in the common conception. But it is a major historical event because of the historical context that these two nations operate in. Now, membership doesn't mean that the Americans are going to station nukes in these countries, doesn't mean 100,000 US Marines basing themselves outside Helsinki. It doesn't mean Abrams tanks basing in Karelia and blitzing St. Petersburg. But it does mean that NATO is getting stronger, particularly as a result of the contributions that the Finns would make in the case of any large war event in the Baltic or over something like Gotland. I think as a result of that, the risk of war probably falls. And that's the whole damn point of NATO. At least if you don't subscribe to the conspiracy theories, the whole idea is to make an alliance that is so overwhelmingly powerful with such an ironclad defensive guarantee that no one's going to bomb it, that no one's going to mess with it, that no one's even going to do those little risks where you try and do a minor provocation, try and get away with the freebie, because the risk of conventional destruction is just too high. If you had asked me a year ago whether we would see Finland and Sweden join NATO in my lifetime, I would have said it is more likely that NATO gets smaller or even eventually disbands over the course of a century than these two states both joining. And yet here we are. So again, one last time, Vladimir Vladimirovich, well done. If you ever want a job with the US State Department, I'm sure they'd hire you. Now, let's close out with the channel update, a relatively quick one. I moved this video up in order to try and keep up with current events, but suffice to say, I haven't forgotten about the other topics I'm planning on covering. Poland is still in re-recording phase, and I'm also editing up a couple of other smaller topics at the same time. This is the first time since I got sick that I've attempted a longer form video. I'm buggered by the end of this, so please forgive me if the energy levels are a bit low, but I feel like I've gotten through it. The next step, as those energy levels continue to rise, is I'll have more time and ability to deal with things like email backlog and engagement with my patrons, which I always enjoy doing. I just haven't had the capacity to do so recently. I do have a long backlog of topics. I do want to eventually branch out. I want to do more European defence or defence industry and economics topics, which is really an area of passion for me. But right now, the Ukraine conflict and the developments around it are so front of mind that I think they deserve the coverage that they're getting. And as a result, that's where I want to keep my focus for the immediate future, looking at Ukraine, but also the changing dynamic of the countries around that crisis as a result. I'd like to thank you again, all of you, for your support, for liking, for commenting, for subscribing, for supporting me on Patreon. All of it helps, all of it is appreciated, and also for all of the good wishes as I recovered from COVID. It was much appreciated. In any case, I hope you've enjoyed this video. For my followers from Sweden and Finland, I hope I have done justice to your history and your geopolitical situation. I look forward to your comments in particular in the comments below. Thank you very much and have a good one.